I'm afraid your friend is absolutely furious with you. In fact, you can hardly call Miss Tenbury Smith your friend. She never wants to see you again. Oh, oh, poor Dora put her hand to her mouth and her eyes widened in sorrow and dismay. But why? Why? She's very angry with you about Mr. Swinton's statue. She was going to change him into a tiger and everything was prepared. But it isn't just that. She feels very bitter about the hat and everything. She sent me to tell you that she never wants to set eyes on you again. Poor Dora. She was a solid, well-built woman, but she just seemed to shrink as Mr. Knapsack spoke. He went on telling lies for another 10 minutes, and then he went back to Hecky. Hecky was waiting for him, her pop eyes bright with hope. I'm afraid it's no good, dear, he said. Dora Maybury never wants to see you again as long as she lives. I won't repeat some of the things she said about you, but they were quite terrible. Hecky turned pale with disappointment. She had come down to meet the furrier in the street because the dragworm was at home, and now she leant against a lamppost almost as though she might faint. Don't be sad, my little prettykin, said Mr. Knapsack, taking her hand. Your Lily will look after you. The horrible man's plan was clear now in his head. He'd been excited at the idea of having one tiger skin to sell. But this, if he pulled it off, he'd be the richest furrier in the world. And he would pull it off. He had one witch in his power. Now he would get the other one too. And then, Chapter 15. Mr. Knapsack now began to court Hecky seriously. He came to see her on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays, and on those days Daniel came at tea time to take the dragworm for a walk. He bought her red roses, which he stole from the garden of the blind lady, and plain chocolates with hard centres because they were her favourites. And one afternoon, sitting on the sofa in her cosy flat, he told her that he wanted to change his life. I'm tired of living in town among the fumes and the dust, said Mr. Knapsack. I want to go and live in the country, where the air is clear, in the Lake District, where there are mountains and heather and lakes. I want to milk cows, said Mr. Knapsack, waving his hand. Sheep, dear, said Hecky. It's sheep you have in hill country. Mr. Knapsack frowned. He did not like to be interrupted and was not quite sure if he wanted to milk sheep. Chickens too, he cried. I want to get up at daybreak and look for brown eggs in the straw. He fished in the pocket of his jacket and showed Hecky a picture. It was of a pretty whitewashed cottage with a porch, standing in the shelter of a high hill. A stream ran through the garden, with alder trees along its bank, and a dovecot covered in honeysuckle stood by the gate. Oh, Lily, what a pretty place. It's called Paradise Cottage, said Mr. Knapsack, and what I want more than anything in the world is to live there. Hecky was silent. When you love somebody, it is sad to think that they may go and live a long way away. But she tried to be brave. If that's what you want, you must do it, Lily. But oh, I shall miss you. Mr. Knapsack seized Hecky's hand. No, no, dearest Hecky, you don't understand. I want you to come with me. I want us to live there together. I'm asking you to marry me. In the staff room of Wellbridge Junior School, they were once again talking about Daniel Trent. He's looking thoroughly peaky again, said the deputy head, just when he seemed so much brighter. I wonder if I ought to have a word with those professors. But it wasn't the fault of Daniel's parents that he was unhappy. They did what they'd always done. It was Hecky's engagement that had made Daniel so wretched. If she'd just been going to marry Mr. Knapsack, it would have been bad enough. But she was going to live miles and miles away in the Lake District, and so soon. Mr. Knapsack wanted to have the wedding before the end of the month. "You'll come and stay with us often and often," Hecky kept saying, and Daniel always answered, "Yes, of course I will." But he knew that he wouldn't. Mr. Knapsack didn't like children. Anyone could see that. "I suppose Hecky must be very happy," said Sumi, when the children met at break. "But she looks awfully tired." "She's worried about the dragworm," said Daniel. "She can't take him with her because of Knapsack being allergious or whatever he is." "Well, I think he's up to something," said Joe. He was sitting on the coal bunker eating a banana and looking more like a small ape than ever. "I believe he's marrying her for a reason. And why can't he ever come and see her on a Monday or a Wednesday or a Friday? What's he doing the other days, do you suppose?" "I tell you, he's a crook. I just know it." But what could the children do? "If we try and warn her, she'll never believe us," said Sumi. "No," said Daniel thoughtfully, "she wouldn't believe us. But there's someone she'd have to believe, isn't there?" The others looked at him. "Yes," said Joe slowly. "I see what you mean." Mr. Knapsack opened the door of his shop and stepped into the street. He was carrying a bunch of roses and a box of chocolates, but the roses were white, not red, and the chocolates were not plain ones with hard centres, but milky ones with soft centres. There were other differences too. When he went to see Hecky, the furrier always wore a dark suit and had his hair parted in the middle. Now he was wearing a white suit and had his hair parted at the side. What was the same though? There was a greedy, furtive look on his face. He crossed Market Square and made his way down the narrow road which led to the bus station. A number 33 was waiting to set off for Fecklington on the north side of the town. And as he rode past the prison and the football ground, the furrier closed his eyes and gloated. In a month, he'd be safely in Spain, leading a life of luxury. Fast cars, casinos, beautiful girls to massage his feet and scoop the wax out of his ears as he lay beside the swimming pool. At Fecklington Green, he got off and walked past a row of shops, then turned down the hill towards a piece of open ground with a barn and workshops. The sound of chipping and hammering came to him across the still air, and he smiled his oily smile. She was a real worker, you had to give her that. "Cooey!" called Mr. Knapsack as he opened the gates of the stonemason's yard. "It's me!" The chipping stopped. Dora Maybury came out of the shed wiping her hands. "Lewis," she said, smiling happily, and bent to sniff the roses. "Your tea's all ready. I've got those cupcakes you like so much. Come on in and make yourself comfortable." When Dora had heard that Hecky was still cross with her, she'd gone to pieces. She fed her hat with any old rubbish, and she didn't care what she turned to stone. Not just the fish fingers and her potted geranium and the bobble on her bedroom slippers, but the ointment she was supposed to rub on her chest for her cough. So that life in the cottage became quite impossible. Even the ghost in the wardrobe got harder and began to creak like a rusty hinge. It's pretty certain that someone would have come and taken Dora away to a mental hospital before much longer. But one Wednesday afternoon, there was a knock at the door and a visitor stood there carrying a bunch of flowers and a box of chocolates. After which, a new life began for Dora Maybury. Twice a week, on Wednesdays and Fridays, the tall, dark man who had brought the message from Hecky came to tea. She didn't like to ask him too many questions, but she learnt that he was called Lewis Kingman. She had already noticed the initials LK stamped on his wallet, and that he worked in insurance. But he wasn't happy in his work, and now, biting into a chocolate cupcake, he told her what he wanted to do with his life. "You see, dearest Dora, I feel I cannot go on living in town," he said. "My lungs are delicate. I need to be in the country, somewhere open and clean, in a house like this." And from the pocket of his suit, he brought out a picture. "What a pretty place," said Dora. "The dovecot and the trees and the way the river runs through the garden." "It's called Paradise Cottage," said Mr. Knapsack. "And what I want more than anything else in the world is to live there with you." For a moment, he wondered whether to go down on his knees. But Dora wasn't very good at dusting, and anyway, there was no need. The silly witch was looking adoringly into his eyes. "Oh, Lewis," she said, "you mean you want to marry me?" "I do," said Mr. Knapsack. The next day, he bought 2 of the cheapest engagement rings he could find and had them engraved with his initials. But it wasn't of the 2 bamboozled witches that he was thinking as he left the shop. It was of a man in a distant country who was almost as crazy and greedy as he was himself. Chapter 16. The name of this man was Abdul el-Hamid, and he was an exceedingly rich sheikh who lived between the Zagros Mountains and the Caspian Sea. The sheikh was rich because his country was full of oil wells, but he was also very old-fashioned, so old-fashioned that he had 150 wives, just as Eastern rulers used to do in the olden days. The wives lived in a palace all of their own, and the sheikh liked to show them off, all dressed alike in beautiful clothes and fabulous jewellery, so that everyone would be amazed that anyone could have so many women and be so generous. In the summer, the country in which the sheikh lived was very hot, but in the winter, because there were high mountains nearby, it was very cold, and it was then that he liked to dress his 150 wives in valuable fur coats. But it is not easy to find 150 coats made of priceless skins and all alike. The sheikh had been looking round and had sent messengers to all the furriers in Europe and had not found one that what he was looking for. This sheikh wanted to see every one of his wives dressed in a coat made of snow leopards. Tigers are beautiful and exciting, so are jaguars and ocelots, and people who like fur coats swear by sable or mink. But in all the world, there is nothing like a coat made of snow leopards. Snow leopards live in the highest mountains in the world, on the slopes of the Himalayas and the Karakoram, where there are no people, only ice and eagles, and the sighing of the wind. They are so graceful and so fearless, and above all, so rare, that to look at one is to feel a lump come into your throat. There are so few left now that to shoot or trap one is to risk being sent to prison, and only a person with no soul would dream of trying it. To kill one snow leopard and make his skin into a fur coat would be almost impossible. To find 300, because at least 2 leopards are needed for a single coat, well, no one but a mad rich sheikh would ever even dream of it. But the sheikh, Abdul el-Hamid, did dream of it. The more he couldn't have what he wanted, the more he was determined to have it. He had offered £1,000 for a snow leopard's skin, and then 1,500, and at last 2,000, and more just for one skin. But there simply weren't any snow leopards to be had. Not even the greediest people were willing to break the law which protected these marvellous and unusual beasts. And then came the day when Mr. Flitchbody, a skin trader who operated in London, but had a network of trappers and hunters all over the world, got a telephone call. "Hello, Is that you, Flitchbody? A throaty voice said. Yes, Flitchbody speaking. Who is that? It's Nacksap here. Lionel Nacksap from Wellbridge. Tell me, is that sheik of yours still after snow leopard pelts? You bet he is. 300 he wants, and he'll sell his soul to get them, and I can't find one. Well, I can, said Mr. Nacksap. I can get him the full quantity if the price is right. The price is 2,800 per skin, and I take 10%, but I don't believe you for a moment. Well, you better believe me. I've found someone who's been breeding them in secret. I can send you the bodies, but you'll have to get them skinned down in London and no questions asked. Can you fix that? I can fix it, but I still think you're bluffing. Well, I'm not. I want the money in cash, 750,000 in notes. Can you do that? If you can get me 300 snow leopards, there's nothing I can't do. I'll keep you posted, said Mr. Nacksap, and put down the phone. Chapter 17. Mr. Nacksap and Hecky were sitting side by side on Hecky's sofa and being romantic. Mr. Nacksap was holding Hecky's hand, the one that didn't have the knuckle of power, and they were looking into the gas fire and dreaming dreams. Or rather, Mr. Nacksap was dreaming dreams. Hecky's foot had gone to sleep, which sometimes happens when you are being romantic, but she didn't like to say so. I was thinking, my dear, said Mr. Nacksap, about when we are married and living in our cottage in the hills, Paradise Cottage. Yes, dear, said Hecky. What were you thinking about it? I was thinking how beautiful the mountains are up there. Beautiful, but bare, terribly bare. Why, yes, of course, there is the heather, isn't there, said Hecky. That's very pretty when it flowers. But it only flowers in August. I would like to be able to look up at the hills and see them covered with something really wonderful, with animals that are happy in high places and that are graceful and lovely and a joy to graze at all the year round. Heather is all right for ladies, said Mr. Nacksap, but gentlemen like something a little stronger. What sort of something? Hecky wanted to know. Mr. Nacksap let go of her hand and turned to look into her eyes. I am going to tell you a secret, Hecate, he said, something I've not told anyone in my life. Always I've had the same dream, that I wake in the morning and I look up, and there on the mountainside above me are the loveliest and most impressive animals in the world. Hecky was very interested. Really, dear? And what are they? Mr. Nacksap blew his nose. Then he said, snow leopards. Snow leopards? Hecky was very surprised. But dearest, you don't find snow leopards in the Lake District. They're not English things at all. You find them in the Himalayas. I know, dearest, said Mr. Nacksap. So far you don't find them in England. But you could. He seized both her hands. You could make my dream come true, he said, rolling his eyes. You, my dearest, sweetest witch, could fill the hillside with snow leopards. You could grant me my greatest wish. Every morning I would lift up my eyes and there they would be. They're the most valuable, the most beautiful creatures in the world. Their pelts, their fur is the deepest, the palest. Their tails are thick and long. They have golden eyes, and every day as I ate my porridge and kippers, which you would cook for me, I would see them roaming free and lovely over the hills. If I could do that, I think I would be the happiest man in the world. He looked sideways under his sinister eyebrows at Hecky, who was looking very worried indeed. But dearest, a whole hillside of snow leopards. I don't see how I could do that, and I'm afraid they'd eat the sheep. Oh, but once the snow leopards came, it would become an animal reserve, that's certain, and think of the tourist trade and the work it would bring to the unemployed. I could make 1 or 2 leopards for you. I'm sure to meet 1 or 2 really wicked people before we get married. But a whole hillside? I don't see how I could possibly do that. How many do you want? 300, said Mr. Knacksack firmly, at least. Hecky leapt to her feet. 300? My dearest Lily, that's quite impossible. There probably aren't 300 wicked people in Britain, let alone Wellbridge. Yes, there are, my treasure. There are 300 wicked people right here in this town, very wicked people. Murderers and terrorists and embezzlers and thugs, people who shouldn't be eating their heads off at the government's expense, people who'd be much happier roaming the hills as free and graceful leopards for me to look at when I ate my kippers. But where? Asked Hecky. What do you mean? In the prison, of course. In Wellbridge Prison, not a mile from here. He leant back, well pleased with himself, and waited for Hecky to tell him how clever he was. You mean you want me to turn all the prisoners into leopards? Asked Hecky, looking stunned. I do, said the furrier smugly. The witch shook her head. I'm sorry, Lily, but I can't do that. Mr. Knacksack was absolutely furious. How dare she go against his wishes? Can't? What do you mean you can't? He said, and turned away so that she wouldn't see him grinding his teeth. Hecky sighed. You see, people get sent to prison for all sorts of things. There's no way I could be sure that all of them are wicked. If someone bopped his mother-in-law with a meat cleaver, he mightn't be really bad. It would depend. Everybody in Wellbridge Jail is bad, hissed the furrier. It's a high-security prison. That means that anyone who gets out will certainly strike again. And anyway, I'd have thought you'd want to make your Lily happy. I'd have thought... I do want to make you happy, said Hecky. I want to terribly. But one has to do what is right, and changing people who are not wicked is not right. It was at this moment that the doorbell rang and Daniel and Joe came in, carefully carrying a large round box covered in brown paper. We took this from the delivery boy, said Joe. It's addressed to both of you. I expect it's a wedding present. He handed the box to the furrier, who took it and simpered. If people were sending silver or valuable glass, he'd have to be sure of getting it to his place so that he could sell it before he bolted for Spain. But where's the dragworm? Asked Hecky, looking at Daniel. I thought you were taking him out. I was, said Daniel, but I met Sumi and she wanted to take him for a bit. Hecky nodded and smiled at Mr. Knacksack, who was eagerly undoing the parcel. Perhaps it was a soup tureen, thought the furrier, that could fetch a couple of hundred, or an antique clock. But as he tore off the wrappings, his look of greed turned to one of puzzlement, for there seemed to be holes in the cardboard box, and surely neither soup tureens nor clocks needed to breathe. Ugh! It's a monster! A horrible diseased thing full of boils. Get rid of it! Get it out! Shoo! The boy stood very still and looked at Hecky. Now at last she would see. It had been very hard to bring Hecky's familiar into the room, knowing what would happen to him, but the children would have done anything to save the witch. It's a dragworm, Hecky, said Daniel quietly. Too late. Mr. Knacksack realised his mistake. He began to cough and splutter and totter round the room. "Oh, help! My asthma! I'm choking! I can't breathe!" But for once, Heki didn't rush to the furrier's side. She had gathered up the dragworm, so shocked by what she saw that at first she couldn't speak. Her familiar had been in a bad way when he was close to Mrs. Winnipeg, but it was nothing to the state he was in now. The hair on his topknot wasn't just white, it was as brittle as that of a 90-year-old. Some of his scales had actually flaked off. His eyes were filmed over. As for his other end, the most hardened sick nurse would have shed tears when she saw the dragworm's tail. "Oh, you poor, poor love, you poor thing," cried Heki. And as she stroked his head, there came from his throat that ghostly, faint, heartbreaking quack. "I don't understand it," said Heki. "What has happened? What made him come on like that?" It was Joe who spoke. "He did. Mr. Knapsack did. That's why we brought the dragworm, so that you could see what kind of a person." "Stop it! That's enough!" Heki's pop eyes snapped with temper. "How dare you speak like that about the man I'm going to marry?" But she looked at Mr. Knapsack in a very puzzled way. The furrier, though, had recovered himself. Still pretending to cough and wheeze, he drew himself up to his full height and pointed at the boys. "You lying, evil children! How dare you tell poor Heki such untruths? As though I didn't see you. I saw you quite distinctly taking this poor sensitive creature right up to the prison gate and along the prison walls. Quite distinctly I saw you. And I thought then how foolish it was to risk him like that." "We didn't," said Daniel and Joe together. "Honestly, we didn't. We wouldn't do a silly thing like that." "In the tartan shopping basket," Mr. Knapsack went on. "I saw you not half an hour ago." He turned to Heki. "Now will you believe me? Now will you believe me when I tell you how evil those prisoners are?" Heki looked desperately from the furrier to the boys and back again. She was a sensible witch, but no one can be in love and stay sensible for long. "Oh, Daniel, Joe, that was foolish of you. Run along now and I'll put him in the bath. He'll soon be better." So the children left, wretched and defeated, having made the dragworm ill for nothing. And that night Heki phoned the furrier. "All right, Lionel," she said wearily. "I'll do what you ask. You shall have your leopards." To the stone witch, Mr. Knapsack didn't say anything about snow leopards. What he spoke to Dora about was his cousin Alfred. "What happened to my poor dear cousin is the one thing that is spoiling my happiness," he said, dabbing his eyes with his handkerchief. "What has happened to him?" asked Dora Maybury. "He is in prison," said Mr. Knapsack and sighed. "Here in Wellbridge, that sweet, sensitive soul, eating his heart out amongst all those ruffians." "Oh, Lewis, that's so sad. How did it happen?" "It wasn't Alfred's fault, I promise you. He was led astray by bad people. If only you could have seen him as a little boy. We were such friends. He used to build sandcastles for me, and whenever his mummy bought him a lollipop, he would let me have a lick. Look at his photograph. Isn't that an innocent face?" Dora took the picture and said, "Yes, it was. And fancy him having ringlets." The picture was actually of a child actor who played little Lord Fauntleroy in a film. "What is he in prison for?" she asked. "He stole the purse out of an old lady's handbag. The wicked people he fell in with made him do it." He dabbed at his eyes again and sniffed. "If only I could get him out of prison. I would send him to a wonderful mind doctor that I know of. Then he'd soon be well again and never do anything bad anymore. But how could you, Lewis? How could you get him out? This time, Mr. Knacksat did go down on his knees. After all, soon he would be able to buy dozens of pairs of new trousers, hundreds of them. With you to help me, dearest Dora, I could do it. If you could turn the prison guards to stone, just for one night, I could get him out. Dora thought for a while, and then she said that if it was only his cousin Alfred he was going to get out, and if she could turn the guards back into people the next day, she didn't mind. I couldn't leave them stone, of course, because they aren't wicked, not so far as I know. But for a night it shouldn't hurt. Oh, my dearest, dearest Dora, said Mr. Knacksat, you've made me so happy. I just couldn't face sitting over my porridge and kippers in Paradise Cottage, knowing that poor dear Alfred was lying in a cold stone cell. Then he went back to town and put up a big for sale notice outside his shop. Everything was ready, and there was nothing between him and £750,000. And that's where I'm leaving it for today.